You have no idea what a nightmare I had. What was supposed to be just another ordinary day in my routine turned into a terrifying experience that I will never be able to erase from my mind. On that fateful evening, I was at home in Edinburgh, Scotland, watching a bit of television after a long day at work. The weather outside was awful, with heavy rain and intense winds rattling the windows. Suddenly, I heard knocking on the door. I thought it was strange after all who was going to visit me in the middle of that storm. Reluctantly, I went to answer it. To my surprise, it was Joseph, my longtime friend and a member of St. Andrew's Cathedral. He was soaking wet and his countenance was one of sheer terror. "John has lost his mind," were the first words out of his mouth. "He's performing a forbidden ritual and has summoned demonic forces inside the cathedral." I couldn't help laughing at first, believing that Joseph was only joking. But then he told me some disturbing details. John Campbell, the cathedral's religious leader, was obsessed with gaining more power and influence. Blinded by his ambition, he decided to perform a secret ritual, even though he was warned by his closest followers about the dangers involved. According to Joseph, John recited words in an ancient language during the ritual, causing a tremor that shook the cathedral itself. A dense fog began to spread through the compound, and spectral shadows began to materialize before his horrified eyes. Joseph was visibly shaken as he continued his terrifying account. He said that in the midst of this supernatural haze, a demonic entity manifested itself in front of John, a repulsive creature with twisted horns, flaming eyes, and sharp fangs. According to him, the voice of that evil being echoed throughout the cathedral, making the walls shake. It was a guttural and terrifying tone that seemed to drain the very soul out of those who heard it. The entity made John a sinister proposal. It would grant him immeasurable powers, provided he performed human sacrifices in its name. I refused to believe what Joseph was saying, but he insisted that it was the truth. He told me that John, seduced by the promise of unlimited power, accepted the demonic offer without hesitation. In that instant, all his supposed love for God and the Christian faith vanished, replaced by an unhealthy obsession with domination. With a dark wave of his hand, John summoned his most faithful followers to the cathedral, claiming that there would be a special ritual. Poor naive souls. They could never have imagined the cruel fate that awaited them. One by one, Joseph watched in horror as these people were dragged into a secret chamber where John performed the sacrifices on behalf of the demonic creature. The screams of agony echoed off the stone walls, mingled with John's dark mutterings during the macabre rituals. Joseph narrowly managed to escape and came to alert me to what was happening. His clothes were stained with blood and his eyes reflected an indescribable dread. He begged for my help, pleading with me to find a way to stop John before it was too late. Joseph's words left my heart cold. I couldn't believe that this man, who had once been a respected religious leader, had given himself over to such dark and evil forces. But Joseph's accounts were so vivid and terrifying that there was no doubting it. He continued to recount the terrifying events he had witnessed inside St. Andrew's Cathedral. The screams of pain and agony of the sacrificed followers echoed off the stone walls, as if from the depths of hell itself. John performed the rituals with impressive cruelty, his eyes reflecting only a sick obsession with the power offered by the demonic entity. As more sacrifices were made, Joseph witnessed the evil creature growing stronger. Its form became more defined, more terrifying. Its twisted horns seemed to grow, and its sharp fangs gleamed with a dark radiance. The dense fog that hung over the cathedral thickened, suffocating any remnants of light or hope. The few remaining followers were seized by indescribable terror. Some tried to flee but were quickly captured and dragged back to the macabre rituals. Joseph told me about a young couple who begged for mercy, only to have their throats ripped out before their eyes. John's thirst for power seemed to have no limits. He behaved like a man possessed, carrying out increasingly cruel and inhuman acts. His eyes, once full of compassion, now shone with murderous madness. Joseph said that at that moment, John was no longer human. He was just an empty shell, guided by the evil desires of the demonic entity. As Joseph recounted these disturbing details, I could feel the fear growing inside me. How could a man give himself over so easily to darkness, sacrificing innocent lives for the sake of power? John's ambition had completely blinded him, turning him into a monster without remorse or compassion. As Joseph continued his terrifying account, I learned that the atrocities committed by John Campbell inside St. Andrew's Cathedral did not go unnoticed for long. The screams and deafening noise of the macabre rituals eventually attracted the attention of the authorities. Joseph said that one night the police were called by residents of the neighborhood who reported strange and disturbing sounds coming from the cathedral. However, even when faced with signs of suspicious activity, the officers hesitated to intervene immediately. After all, this was a respected religious leader, and they probably thought there could be nothing more serious going on. While the police were reluctant to act, John Campbell continued performing his bloodthirsty rituals, sacrificing more and more lives in the name of the demonic entity he had summoned. The evil creature grew stronger with each new sacrifice, its powers growing in an overwhelming way. As his demonic influence grew, John began to terrorize not only the followers inside the cathedral, but also the entire city of Edinburgh. He used his new powers to spread chaos and suffering, as if he were a messenger from hell itself. Joseph described to me disturbing scenes of buildings collapsing inexplicably, injuring and killing dozens of people. Fires broke out for no apparent reason, consuming everything in their path. Even worse, those who dared to challenge John or question his actions simply disappeared, never to be seen again. The demonic entity, fueled by John's sacrifices and blind devotion, grew stronger and stronger. Its evil presence spread through the city like a toxic cloud of fear and despair. Edinburgh was being consumed by darkness, and no one seemed able to stop this destructive force. When Joseph told me about the events that followed, I was chilled to the bone. The situation in Edinburgh had reached a critical point, and the authorities finally decided to act against the evil forces unleashed by John Campbell. With increasingly disturbing reports coming in from all parts of the city, the police could no longer ignore what was happening. They mounted a large-scale operation surrounding St. Andrew's Cathedral with dozens of heavily armed officers. Joseph was there when it all happened. He witnessed the arrival of the police forces, determined to put an end to John's reign of terror and the demonic entity that controlled him. However, what followed was an epic and bloody battle that no one could have predicted. As soon as the police entered the cathedral, they were greeted by a horde of spectral creatures summoned by John's dark powers. These terrifying entities, with distorted forms and eyes glowing with evil, attacked mercilessly, tearing and ripping apart anyone who crossed their path. Joseph described to me scenes of absolute horror, with officers being thrown against walls like rag dolls, their screams of agony echoing through the dungeons of the cathedral. Some were literally dismembered before his eyes, while others had their souls ripped from their bodies by supernatural forces. In the midst of the carnage, John Campbell emerged as a dark and imposing figure, laughing madly as he commanded his demonic legions. His ambition for power had completely corrupted him, transforming him into a being devoid of any trace of humanity. Even wounded and weakened by the confrontations, John was kept alive by the demonic entity that controlled him. He was its loyal servant, and there was still much more to be done to spread terror and destruction throughout Edinburgh. As Joseph continued his account, my stomach churning with each new terrifying detail, I learned that the situation in Edinburgh had become a veritable hell on earth. The entire city was gripped by the most absolute terror and chaos, as the evil presence of the demonic entity spread unchecked. Joseph told me about frightening reports coming in from all corners of Edinburgh. People reported seeing terrifying shadows moving through the deserted streets at night, leaving a trail of destruction wherever they went. Cars were thrown against walls as if they were toys, and screams of agony echoed through the dark alleyways. In some cases, witnesses claimed to have seen the ghostly figure of John Campbell himself wandering aimlessly, muttering incomprehensible words in an ancient and sinister language. His eyes were empty, as if he had completely lost his soul to the demonic entity that controlled him. Those who dared to cross John's path, or that of the creatures that accompanied him, quickly regretted it. Joseph told me the story of an entire family who simply disappeared after having the misfortune of witnessing one of John's macabre rituals. They were never seen or heard from again, as if they had been completely erased from existence. With each passing day, more buildings collapsed without explanation, buried by an invisible evil force. Fires broke out in random places, consuming everything in their path and leaving dozens of victims in their wake. Edinburgh was being consumed by an unprecedented wave of destruction, and no one seemed able to stop it. The authorities were completely powerless in the face of this supernatural threat. Their efforts to contain the spread of terror were futile, as they were dealing with forces that transcended human comprehension. The entire city was plunged into a constant state of panic, with residents locked in their homes fearing the next demonic attack. As Edinburgh sank deeper and deeper into the grip of the terror unleashed by John Campbell and the demonic entity, a small group of survivors decided to take desperate action. Joseph was part of this group, united by the desire to find a way to stop the evil forces ravaging the city. According to Joseph, they searched tirelessly for clues and information that could help them understand the true nature of the creature John had summoned. They leafed through old books, searched through obscure archives, and even consulted witches and psychics, willing to try anything to save what was left of Edinburgh. After weeks of relentless searching, they finally found a crucial clue. An ancient manuscript written in an archaic language spoke of a purification ritual capable of subduing and banishing demonic entities back to the depths of hell from whence they came. Gathering all the necessary ingredients and items, the group prepared to carry out the dangerous ritual. Joseph described the tense preparations to me, with each member of the group aware that they could be sacrificing their own lives in this endeavor. They chose the ruins of an ancient abbey in the nearby hills as the site for the ritual. Under the light of the full moon, the chants and invocations began, while a circle of protection was drawn on the ground with herbs and mystical symbols. The tension was palpable, and Joseph said he could feel an evil presence hovering around them, as if they were being watched. Suddenly, shadows began to move in the surrounding trees, and terrifying screams echoed through the night. They had been discovered. In a matter of minutes, the group found themselves surrounded by a horde of demonic creatures sent by John to stop the ritual. Joseph recounted the fierce battle that followed, with members of the group being dragged and torn apart before his eyes. But they didn't give up. With unwavering determination, they continued the chants and invocations, while desperately defending themselves against the demonic attacks. The final battle had begun, and Edinburgh's fate hung by a thread. Joseph's account of the final battle against John Campbell and the demonic entity that controlled him was simply terrifying. He described scenes of graphic violence and supernatural horror that could never be erased from his mind. Even though some members of the group were massacred by the demonic hordes, the survivors persisted with the purification ritual. Joseph said he could feel a powerful energy flowing through the earth, fueled by the ancient chants and invocations. Suddenly, a blinding light erupted from the protective circle, so intense that it burned the eyes of anyone who dared to look directly at it. The demonic creatures recoiled, howling in pain at this purifying glow. It was at this moment that John Campbell appeared, his imposing, shadowy figure emerging from the darkness like a herald from hell itself. His eyes glowed with a demonic fury, and his voice echoed with an uncommon force, shaking the very ground. He ordered his legions to attack again, determined to stop the ritual at any cost. What followed was unspeakable carnage, with the remaining members of the group fighting bravely against the hordes of terrifying creatures. Joseph witnessed scenes of bodies being torn apart, limbs ripped off, and blood gushing out like a macabre fountain. But despite the terrible casualties, they remained steadfast, channeling all their strength into completing the ritual. Finally, after what seemed like endless hours of fierce battle, the purifying energy reached its peak. A wave of blinding light swept through the area, consuming all the demonic creatures in its path. John Campbell was thrown backwards by this overwhelming force, howling in agony as the evil entity that possessed him was expelled back into the depths of hell. In the end, only Joseph and 2 others survived, surrounded by the mutilated bodies of their fallen comrades. Victory had been achieved, but at too terrible a cost. Even after the demonic entity's defeat and the expulsion of its evil presence from Edinburgh, the scars left by those terrifying events remained open, bleeding constantly. Joseph told me that in the days and weeks that followed, rumors began to circulate around the city about sightings of a ghostly figure wandering the deserted streets at night. It was John Campbell, or what was left of him after his soul was consumed by darkness. Some witnesses reported seeing him walking aimlessly, muttering incomprehensible words in an ancient and sinister language. His eyes were empty, like bottomless pits, and his appearance was that of a walking corpse. Others told even more disturbing stories of being plagued by vivid nightmares involving John and the demonic creatures he had summoned. Dreams so real that they woke up screaming, bathed in cold sweat. Joseph admitted that he himself suffered from these terrifying night visions. He said he could feel John's evil presence lurking in his memories, like a dark specter that would never leave him. The whole city seemed to have been left in a state of collective trauma after the horrors witnessed. Edinburgh would never be the same again, remaining under the shadow of that unspeakable terror. St. Andrew's Cathedral, the scene of John's macabre rituals, was completely abandoned. No one dared approach those blood-stained walls, fearing that they still harbored traces of the demonic energy that had been awakened. Even the survivors of the group that performed the purification ritual didn't manage to escape unscathed. Joseph told me about companions who developed severe psychological disorders, unable to cope with the trauma of having faced evil in its purest form. Some simply disappeared, choosing to flee Edinburgh to try to restart their lives elsewhere. But Joseph remained, determined to be a living witness to the terrifying events that ravaged his hometown. As Joseph concluded his terrifying account, it became increasingly clear that the emotional scars left by the events in Edinburgh would never fully heal. What happened deeply marked the soul of that city and all those who survived. Joseph told me that even years later, he could still feel the dark presence of those days of terror hanging over Edinburgh. It was as if a dark cloud of despair and evil had settled permanently over the city, a constant reminder of the price paid for John Campbell's blind ambition. Those who managed to overcome the initial trauma still carried the weight of those terrifying memories. Joseph described friends and neighbors who, although they seemed to function normally on the surface, had empty, distant gazes, as if a part of their souls had been ripped away. Some developed severe psychological disorders, unable to cope with the disturbing images that haunted their minds. Joseph told me about a man who simply went mad, wandering the streets and screaming about demons and hideous creatures that only he could see. St. Andrew's Cathedral, the centerpiece of that nightmare, remained abandoned and sealed, a grim reminder of the destructive power of religious fanaticism taken to the extreme. No one dared approach those blood-stained walls, fearing that they still harbored traces of the demonic energy that had been awakened. Joseph said that he once tried to enter the cathedral to confront his own inner demons, but as soon as he crossed the threshold, he was overcome by a sense of dread so intense that he had to run, suffocated by the weight of those terrifying memories. Edinburgh had become a grim and permanent reminder of the price to be paid when power is pursued at any cost, even if it means making a pact with the darkest and most evil forces in the universe. The entire city bore the scars of that traumatic experience, like an open wound that would never completely heal. As Joseph concluded his account, his gaze distant and somber, I could feel the weight of those terrifying memories hanging over us. It was a vivid reminder of the destructive power of darkness and how easily human ambition can lead us to cross boundaries that should never be crossed.